As I mentioned earlier, we truly have an abundance of riches with respect to our speakers. Terrific lineup of some of the top experts, folks with vast government and non-governmental experience, current and former diplomats, government officials with practical hands-on experience on Ukraine and indeed the region, analysts, program implementers, and NGO activists. I've had the privilege of interacting and working with most of them over the years in one capacity or another, and I can assure you that beyond their expertise, there's a really strong commitment to strengthening U.S.-Ukraine relations and helping Ukraine to succeed. So we have, as I noted before, but we've had more people come in, much to cover in a short amount of time. It is a crowded schedule, and I've been tasked with introducing all of the moderators and panel speakers. Many of our speakers and panelists do have extensive bios, but in the interests of time, I'm only going to point out some of the highlights. Our first panel is titled Roadmap for the Next President. Roadmap, where we heard that lately with the Minsk process last week, but Roadmap for the Next President, Finding Success in Ukraine. How can the United States, specifically the next president, help Ukraine succeed, not only in helping Ukraine to fend off Russian aggression, but also in facilitating domestic reforms so critical to Ukraine's democratic development, economic well-being, and indeed its security and stability? I would just add the role not only of president, but as Roman pointed out, the role of Congress in the foreign policy process, which traditionally has provided strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, and we've certainly seen that in the last few years. Congress can't agree on much, but they do agree on Ukraine. Also critical to success is U.S. working as constructively as possible with other international actors, whether it be the EU, NATO, the OSCE, the UN, IFIs, individual countries. Our panelists will be discussing, I believe, specific FOUN, Friends of Ukraine Network, recommendations for the new administration in foreign policy, the economy, and security. Our first speaker, I'll first introduce the speakers and then the moderator. Our first speaker is Ambassador Stephen Pifer. He's the Director of Arms Control and Nonproliferation Initiative at the Brookings Institute and a Senior Fellow in both the Institute's Center for the 21st Century Security and Intelligence and the Center on the United States and Europe. Previous positions include Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, where he had responsibility for Russia and Ukraine, among others. U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 98 to 2000, and service in numerous other capacities for the State Department, including U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as a stint, I believe, at the NSC. Ambassador William Taylor is Executive Vice President at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Previous positions include Special Coordinator for Middle East Transitions at the State Department, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009, Director of Iraq Reconstruction and Management Office, Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Afghanistan, and, among other things, Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Anders Ostlund is a resident senior fellow at the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, a leading specialist on East European economies. He's the author of 13 books, including at least 2 on Ukraine, I believe. He's worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Brookings Institution, Woodrow Wilson Center, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and as an economic advisor, excuse me, to both the governments of Russia and Ukraine. And our moderator will be yet another ambassador, Ambassador William Green Miller, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, 1993 to 98, our second ambassador, who most recently held position as Senior Policy Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, the Middle East Institute, and serves as co-chair, among other things, of the Kiev Mohyla Foundation. Throughout his career, Ambassador Miller has had numerous positions in the diplomatic, political, NGO, and academic worlds. And with that, let me turn it over to our moderator, Ambassador Miller.
Thank you, Orest. Ukraine is in all of our hearts. It never lets you go. And it's central to the policy issues that face our country and the world in the coming year. The situation in Ukraine is dire. It needs to be addressed in a forceful way, and the instruments that are available to the United States and the world have to be used more effectively in order to meet the challenges that we face. The challenges are criminal in nature, aggression, death and destruction of another country by Russia. And it's a fundamental issue to be faced head-on, directly, forcefully. And I would say that the necessity only grows day by day. The occupation and annexation of Crimea, the subversion of Donbass are criminal acts that should be addressed forcefully, because the criminal acts will continue unless they are addressed forcefully. I have one recommendation for the next administration. That is to address the issues forcefully. In this respect, I urge my colleagues who are former ambassadors to join together and go to Ukraine in the next several months and write a report collectively on the situation that we find and make recommendations based on firsthand information. We have to use our experience and our clout, such as it may be, to help the next administration find its way. I would like to turn to Steve for his remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. As Bill said, Ukraine faces a very difficult situation at present, and there really are two key challenges that it needs American and Western help to address. First is a settlement on acceptable terms to Kyiv of the conflict with Russia, and second is proceeding with reform, the types of changes within Ukraine that will put Ukraine on the path to becoming a normal European state. And it's in the U.S. interest, it's in the interest of Europe to help Ukraine succeed in these questions. First of all, a stable, democratic, prosperous, successful Ukraine is the kind of neighbor, it's the kind of country that the European Union and NATO want to have on their borders. Second, it's also, though, important that the West resist the kind of aggression we've seen from Russia, the flouting of the rules of the European security order that have been central to the peace and stability that Europe has enjoyed for the last 35 years. So what sorts of things can the United States and the West do to help deal with Russia's aggression? First of all, the new administration should be looking for ways to provide political support to Ukraine. Some of that is just being there. Visits are important. Vice President Biden's visits, I think, have been a very good signal of American support for Ukraine. But it's going to be also important that Ukraine get on the agenda. The president, when hopefully she takes office in January, is going to have a very busy foreign policy agenda. And it's going to be important that Ukraine figure on that agenda. In addition to political support, there's the question of military assistance. There are some assistance that's coming from countries in NATO. The United States, Britain, and Canada have all provided training. I've argued in the past and would continue to argue that some low-end defensive weapons, anti-armor weapons, would be useful for Ukraine, particularly in a situation now where you look at what's now in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. There's actually more armor there than is in the German army today. The goal here is not to give the Ukrainian army the ability to drive the Russians and the separatists out. They're not going to be able to do that. But what we want to do is give the Ukrainian military a stronger capability to raise the cost of aggression, to deter further Russian and separatist actions in a way that take away easy military options and encourage the Russians to pursue a real negotiated settlement. A third part of the effort needs to be keeping up the political and the economic pressure on Russia to fulfill the terms of the Minsk II agreement. That means continued support for sanctions and a readiness, if Russian behavior deteriorates, to apply new sanctions. I would note in this regard that I think it's important, though, that sanctions remain executive branch actions and not get fixed in congressional legislation. My worry is that if it gets fixed by an act of Congress, Congress historically is much better at putting on sanctions than taking them off. And the worry is that if the Russians see congressionally enacted sanctions, they may not see a way out of those sanctions. So I hope that stays very much in the executive branch. Another point is to encourage Ukraine to stay with the Minsk II process. And I say that believing, quite frankly, that Minsk II will not succeed, because I see no interest on the part of the Russians or the separatists to make it succeed. But at this point in time, there is no negotiating alternative for Ukraine. If Kyiv withdraws from the Minsk process, it will end up, I believe, facing Russia one-on-one, because it's not clear why other countries would then choose to get involved. I believe that Germany and Chancellor Merkel have been very supportive of Ukraine in the last 2 years. She has a very full set of issues on her plate. If she is released from Minsk II, why does she choose to get back in? And I think that decreases the bargaining position for Ukraine. A challenge for the next administration in 2017 is going to be keeping Europe focused on Ukraine. And that's going to be difficult because of other things going on within Ukraine. You'll have elections in both France and Germany. You already have the German foreign minister, who is also a political rival of Chancellor Merkel, campaigning for a softer position on Russia, driven by not, I think, a calculation of Germany's foreign policy interests, but by domestic political interests. That will complicate things for Ukraine. You have the question of Brexit, which unfortunately works against Ukraine in two ways. First of all, Britain has been one of the voices at the center of EU councils that have been most supportive of Ukraine. That voice is now going to be moving away from the center of the European Union. Second, just the mechanics of Britain's departure from the European Union is going to consume huge amounts of time at EU meetings and European Union summits. And that's going to take away from the time and attention that the European Union has to devote for Ukraine. And you add that to other questions like the issues of migrations and refugees, and it's going to take, I think, work on the part of the next administration to ensure that Europe maintains its focus on Ukraine. Now, to promote reform within Ukraine, it seems to me the United States and Europe should be continuing to provide technical assistance, be prepared to provide additional resources, provided that Ukraine, in fact, accelerate reform. There needs to be conditionality. And ultimately, we should be thinking about how do we move Ukraine from a country that is dependent on international financial assistance to a country that can attract investment in a way that grows the economy and moves it down the path that countries such as Poland and the Czech Republic followed in the 1990s. I think the United States and the West should press Ukraine to do more reform faster. They've done a lot, and Andres can, I think, talk about how much has been done, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. It's some examples: privatization of state-owned enterprises. In the energy sector, Ukraine has taken big steps with the raising of energy tariffs to cover the cost of production and delivery of energy, but there's still much more to make that energy sector competitive, transparent, and non-corrupt. Reform of the judicial sector, but most of all, from what I hear from Ukrainians, is the need to come to grips with corruption. And all too often, you hear or you read stories where people say, corruption continues, it's not quite at the level of Yanukovych. It would be hard to have corruption at the level of Yanukovych, but people say the corruption persists, it's just that the money's going to different people. And that needs to change. And I think the U.S. and the Western approach towards Ukraine should be one of tough love. Tough in terms of insisting on pressing the government to do more, conditionalities for Western assistance, and also in some cases, this is an idea that David Kramer suggested, which I support, targeting individuals, corrupt individuals in Ukraine for visa and financial sanctions, to push them really to take on the struggle to corruption that is necessary if Ukraine wants to be a normal European state. The love part of the message is that if Ukraine does these actions, if it accelerates reforms, then the West should be prepared to provide more assistance to help them make that transition. I think it's important to press Ukraine to do more because support for Ukraine now is falling. It's falling within Ukraine, where you see now President Poroshenko in approval ratings now lags behind both Yulia Tymoshenko and lags behind the head of the reformed Party of Regions. But you also in Europe see a sense of questioning, is this Ukrainian government truly committed to the kinds of reform that Ukraine needs, in fact, to change? And it comes at a time where you have some in Germany, I'm sorry, not in Germany, but in Greece, in Hungary, Italy, and even France, want to get back to business as usual with Moscow. And my concern is that there could be an erosion of support for pressure on Russia, an erosion of European support for sanctions, unless Ukraine does more. And here my worry is, there have been various times where it looked like Ukraine got it. We saw it, I think, in 1994 with President Kuchma, an initial burst of economic reform, but then it slowed down. When I was there in 2000, when Viktor Yushchenko became prime minister, another burst of reform, but then it slowed down. We saw the disappointment in 2005 after the Orange Revolution. If that happens again, there's a real risk, I believe, that countries in Europe are going to conclude that Ukraine is not ready, it's not willing, it's not able to fix itself. And that could bring about a return of Ukraine fatigue as a real risk. So I think the next government, the US government, needs to be pushing both in Europe, it needs to be pushing in Ukraine, it needs to be pushing in Moscow, against Moscow, to try to change things and put Ukraine on a course and take advantage of the opportunity that was created back in 2014. And first and foremost, that's going to require the next administration to be very candid and very direct with the government in Kyiv. Thank you.
An excellent overview, Steve. Anders.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I prefer to stand so I can see you all. And thank you, Nadia, for the invitation and for arranging this conference. What I would like to talk to after Steve has provided the general overview is on the economy. And I want to have focus on three issues. First, how much Ukraine has done in the last 2 years. Secondly, what is the reform agenda now? And thirdly, the role of the United States and the West for the future with regard to economic reform in Ukraine. My big message to you is that Ukraine has massively overperformed in terms of economic reform during the last 2 years, in particular in 2015. Steve touched upon a few things here, but I would emphasize a bit more. The biggest reform is the energy reform. It took away 8% of GDP in energy subsidies. And this money essentially went to a few oligarchs. So this is the biggest anti-corruption reform that we have seen in Ukraine. And mainly as a consequence of this, Ukraine sharply reduced a budget deficit that was untenable of 10% of GDP in 2014. And the last government took it to 2% of GDP. It's a cut of 8% of GDP in 1 year, which is quite extraordinary. This is among the biggest numbers you see anywhere. And this was twice as much cut as the IMF had demanded. So Ukraine strongly overperformed on the main macroeconomic variables with regard to the IMF. The same was true for the foreign payments balance. The current account deficit that had been huge in 2013, also unsustainable, was taken to zero last year by the Ukrainian government through a substantial depreciation of the hryvnia as it was necessary. The Ukrainian banking system was in a terrible shape under Yanukovych. A habit had developed among bank owners to give 80 to 90% of the loans to themselves and not paying back. It means that the bank owners were essentially robbing the banks, that is the depositors, and the central bank that had provided refinancing. Thanks to the governor for 2 years now, Valeria Hontareva, half of the banks have been closed down. Close to 90 banks now out of 180. And these were largely corrupt and generally bankrupt banks. So this was a cleansing that was necessary. So in Ukraine today, all owners of banks are known. There is a complete transparency in this regard, which, for example, does not exist in this country. You have a Delaware company that is completely anonymous, and nobody really knows who owns what. In Ukraine, that is no longer allowed. So this is a substantial anti-corruption measure that has been undertaken. When you pursue good economic policies, you also get larger international reserves. Ukraine's international reserves have increased 3 times, from $5 to $16 billion in the last 1.5 years. Another major anti-corruption reform is to introduce a transparent electronic public procurement, which seems to hold, and there has been substantial deregulation, and there's also been improvement in corporate governance of some of the major companies, in particular in Naftagaz, the energy sector. So these are very substantial improvements. Also the payroll tax, which was excessive at 45%, which meant that half of all salaries seems to have been paid in cash in envelopes. Now it was cut from 45 to 22% from this year, which was quite necessary. So my big message to you is that these reforms have been very substantial. You can hardly demand more in terms of what has been done. But having said that, the reforms were sort of led by half a dozen people who were in charge of Naftagaz, of the central bank, Minister of Finance, Natalie Aresco, and Minister of Economy, Aivaras Abramovicius, a couple of more people. And therefore, the reforms were not comprehensive. So what remains to be done now is essentially 4 big issues. One is corruption in a more narrow sense. The judicial system and prosecution need reform. This is where we see a real battle between the old and the new. The second point is privatization. Ukraine has 3,800 state-owned enterprises. Half of these don't work. These are essentially factory ruins that should be sold off as real estate as fast as possible. But somehow it's not happening. The 2 big reforms that the IMF is emphasizing now is to legalize private sales of agricultural land. Ukrainians are dead frightened that the so-called oligarchs will buy up all the land if private sales are becoming legal. I think that this is complete confusion. The people who benefit from private sales not being allowed are big farm companies that are up to 500,000 hectares of land, and they lease this land for a pittance. And this pittance is given to the people who formerly owned the land, the former members of kolkhozy and people who worked at the state farms. The people who would benefit from private sales are the people who own the land now, because the prices would be much higher. The question is, can one secure so that they can get it? There are simple things that can be done. Sell off the state land that still exists, about a fifth of agricultural land, in small portions, so that people see that the land market functions, and then the right prices will be established, and then the people who own the land will be the beneficiaries. But there need to be a clear plan. And the fourth big reform after judicial reform, privatization, land reform, that is pension reform, where the Ukrainian pension system is 1/3 of a grown-up population get pensions for not very good reason. Retirement age for women is 57, for men 60. Most of these people still work, and pension should be given to the old people who can't manage, rather than to everybody. There's been some tightening up, in particular of early pensions, but much more is needed, and there should be an introduction of savings pension. So this is for the long term. But you can see much more has been accomplished than that has been left out. That's my big message. And then we come to the West. You hear all about all these things about the West providing funds to Ukraine, but when you look up on the numbers, and the most stunning number is that Ukraine's public debt in dollars was $73 billion in 2013. Now it's $65 billion. So what has happened during this period of so-called help for Ukraine is that Ukraine has paid back to the West $8 billion. So this is a complete opposite of what you hear. And the obvious conclusion is it's not Ukraine, but the West that has seriously underperformed. Lots of talk, but the money is not on the table. So my big message to you for this question of a roadmap for the next administration is the West must put more money on the table. And if that is to be done, the US president must lead. Natalia Aresco was here recently, and she argued what I completely agree with. Ukraine should get from the Western community $5 billion a year for the next 5 years in investment funding. This would be credit. It would be paid back. And the sources of this, it would be the US government, the European Union, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the World Bank, and the export credit agencies, and also various bilateral donors like Canada, Germany, etc., Japan. There are many sources. And this is something that needs to be done, because the Ukrainian economy has now stabilized, and what Ukraine now needs is growth. And also discussing these various reforms, there needs to be enough of an incentive so that the good forces feel that they can win, so that they can get substantial growth. Ukraine should have a growth of 6 to 8%. What people are discussing now is 1 to 3%. That is not real growth. Ukraine can do much more. Just think of it. On the western border of Poland, eastern border of Poland, on the Polish side, the average salary is $1,100 a month. On the Ukrainian side, it's $200 a month. This border is open thanks to the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. This is an anomaly. This should be overcome. Why is there so little foreign direct investment in Ukraine? Virtually nil in the last years, because big foreign companies do not invest in a country in war. This is the fundamental reason, and this is an additional reason why the West should move in and correct this market failure. This is a case when the government should come in. And how much is it that Ukraine has lost in investment? Ukraine used to get 4% of GDP in FDI. That's about $8 billion, and now it gets nothing. So here is one part of what Ukraine does not get. And this, the West should come in and fill. $5 billion for the United West a year is very little money. But the US needs to lead in order to get this done. This is my big message for the next US president. Thank you.
Anders, superb.
Thank you.
Bill?
Bill, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be the third of the panelists here because I can be very concise. You won't be surprised that I don't disagree with anything that Steve said or Anders. I can elaborate a little bit and we can talk. I'm hoping to leave some time, Bill, for conversation and questions from the audience here because I think that would be a useful one. Just a couple of comments on Steve's point about Minsk. And I imagine this will come up in subsequent panels as well. I see Ian's over here ready to go on some of these. And David Kramer, as Steve has said, has some thoughts on this. But Steve, I think, made a good point about the Minsk process. And the Ukrainians ought not to walk away from the Minsk process. But the Minsk agreement at this point is a bad one, as Steve has said, and it's not going to succeed. The Minsk process, though, is ongoing. And there's some reason to believe that some adjustment, some renegotiation could come up with a better process, a better outcome. What we know is that the Russians are being squeezed. What we know is the sanctions, and there's a whole panel on sanctions coming up as well, sanctions are having an effect. We know this because when the Russians withdrew from one of the arms control agreements that Steve knows a whole lot about, one of the things they said was, look, we'll come back to that agreement. We'll come back to that arms control agreement having to do with plutonium, but we got to get out from under sanctions. And you got to pay us back for all the damage that's been done on sanctions. And you got to pay us back for the sanctions that we put on ourselves. But it is clear that the Russians are hurting, that these sanctions are having an effect. And that means that these ongoing discussions about Minsk could well come up with some adjustments. So yeah, I would agree with Steve that that the Ukrainians can't walk away, but they can certainly push for, and we can help push for with our German and French colleagues for a better deal on that. Steve made the point on the military side. I'm going to speak a little bit about what specific kind of military support we should be giving, but he talked about deterring, and that's exactly right. I mean, we're not talking about offensive. We're not talking about pushing the Russians out of Donbass, much less Crimea. What we're talking about is deterring further aggression, and there we need to both deter by enhancing Ukraine's military capabilities, but also to contain the Russians while they decline. My sense is Russia is a declining power. It's declining demographically, it's declining economically, we've already talked about that, it's declining politically on the world stage. in terms of the kinds of support that Russia gets on the international community, we've got the clear advantage on that. And Ukraine, being allied with us, is exactly the right place for them to be. I'm here actually with some recommendations from John Herbst, Ambassador John Herbst, who would like to have been here, but he's on a plane. Asked me to present several of the proposals and suggestions, recommendations that he has made in consultation with other people in this room and on this panel for the next administration. And specifically on the military side. He would recommend that in addition to Anders' $5 billion from the international community on the economic side, that on the military side, that the U.S. provide $1 billion a year in military assistance for the next 3 years. Anders talked about 5 years. The recommendation here is $1 billion for 3 years. Again, to enhance the capability of the Ukrainian military to deter. And that is key. Or until there is a peace agreement, until there's a just peace settlement. So that's the first one. Then there's some specific things that John recommends that U.S. and NATO allies presumably supply to the Ukrainian military. At least a dozen more counter-battery radar against missiles to reduce Ukrainian casualties. The missiles that the Russians are using against Ukraine, we hope that they are withdrawing according to these new discussions. But while they are withdrawing, they continue to kill Ukrainian soldiers. And Oksana just mentioned that today, six Ukrainian soldiers were wounded. Additional secure communication system. In order for the Ukrainians to mount a defense, to have a credible defense to deter further aggression, they need to be able to talk to each other. And they need to be able to talk to each other without the Russians listening in. The Ukrainians have an internal problem of Russians in some security services, which they're dealing with, but that's a problem. But if the communications are not secure in real time to coordinate a military defense, this is a problem for them. So secure communication systems would be in order. Anti-tank javelins. Now here again, this is a defense. This is to deter another offensive. But if the Russians know that if they launch attacks, that these weapon systems that we would provide to the Ukrainians can pinpoint the outgoing weapons that are shooting at the Ukrainians. So that would be important. Two more things on intelligence, and then Bill, I will hand it back to you. Drones now have the capability to provide tactical intelligence, and we should provide those to Ukraine. The Russians use them. The Russians shoot down the OSCE drones that are there trying to monitor. So the Ukrainian capabilities there should be enhanced to provide critical tactical intelligence. Finally, properly vetted, but real-time intelligence on Russian military movements inside Ukraine, we're talking about in Donbass, and on its border would be important. And we can do this. It needs to be careful because, as I mentioned earlier, there are problems with providing intelligence that could get to the Russians, but that's an important piece that would round this out. So I would, again, agree with the political support that Steve has talked about, the economic support and financial support that Anders says, and together with this specific military support, to continue, by the way, the good training that the U.S. Army is providing to the various components of the Ukrainian military, that's important as well. We, by the way, the U.S. military we are learning from the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military is the one military right now that's fighting the Russians. So we are learning when our consultations and training sessions with the Ukrainian military, we're learning what it's like, what the Russians are trying, what their tactics are, and this is a benefit to us. So we ought to continue that too. And with that, Bill, back to you.
Let's turn to the audience for questions, and then we'll wrap up. Please.
I'm Elaine Soreo. I'm Associate Rector for Wisconsin International Ukraine University in Kiev, Ukraine. Thank you very much for this opening session. I just returned from Kiev for being there a few weeks, and would like to ask the whole panel, first of all, given the statements made and the progress that has been made and the things that the U.S. should be hopefully doing, not just now, but in the future, where do you see, or have you seen any effort by the U.S. government to act on the $555 million in pledges, the $335 million made by Vice President Biden in March to President Poroshenko for military assistance, and the $220 million pledge, again by Vice President Biden in May to Prime Minister Groisman just for assistance. What is the status of those more than $500 million of U.S. pledges of assistance? Thank you.
Anders.
Well, I think that this is going pretty well on the technical assistance side. USAID has lots of activities. I think that USAID has been very helpful in the support of the structural reforms. I should also say in general that I follow these things rather closely, and the coordination between the IMF and USAID and the European Union, these three, and also EBRD, has been far better than I've seen before. That it's very much one idea that all of them embrace. And of course, it helps very much that Ukraine is an extremely open and transparent country. We can figure out what is going. So without checking the numbers, I think that USAID is doing a very good job in Ukraine now.
Question from the back.
Thank you. I'm Oksana Bedrotenko, independent analyst. I just wanted to make one remark about the importance of humanitarian cooperation with Ukraine. I believe that cooperation on humanitarian issues could, first of all, alleviate the crisis that we have now in Ukraine with IDPs and refugees. And plus, the US would find very good partners in Ukraine. Those are civil society and the NGOs who are in many cases themselves are agents of reform in important sectors like social provisioning and the provisioning of the army, in fact. Thank you.
Can I, Bill, I'll just say something. First of all, thank you, Oksana. People should talk to Oksana this afternoon and today. She knows something about Ukraine, having worked for virtually every U.S. ambassador who has been there has been relying on Oksana. And she's now here, so you should see her. And brings up a very good point that we haven't talked about yet, which is the role of civil society. Steve talked about the bursts of reform and of enthusiasm for Ukraine, and all true. But this burst, I think, is different from earlier bursts in that I believe now that we see that the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian civil society is now fully supportive and fully active and much more powerful. Now people from the civil society are being elected into the Rada. And there's a challenge there. We know all the challenges of the various parties, but driven by civil society across the country, I think this time it can be sustained.
It's obvious that the Maidan generation should be supported fully, and they shed blood for Ukraine. They proved they care in the deepest way possible, and they should be supported. And you are a party to that activity, and we should support you.
Hello. My name is Katya Sedova from Ukrainian Association of Washington State. currently at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And my question to you today, first of all, I want to thank you for the esteemed remarks. My question is, we speak a lot about containment in terms of this conflict. We speak a lot about how to deter further aggression. What do you see as the conditions that have to take place in order for Ukraine to regain the territory it has lost?
Yeah, no, I think I would break the problem down into two pieces, Donbass and Crimea. In the case of Donbass, I think it requires continued Western political and economic pressure on Ukraine that would hopefully bring Moscow to a point where Moscow begins to actually look for a genuine solution. And when I talk about a solution, on terms acceptable to Kyiv, because Moscow has a settlement in mind, but it's an unacceptable settlement. I mean, it would basically give power to local authorities to disrupt national level policies on the foreign policy side, on defense and such like that. So the question is to keep the pressure on the Russians, while, as Bill said, helping Ukraine to deter further military action and to bring Moscow to the point where they conclude that it's in their interest to pursue a different policy. I think that's going to take a long time because right now it appears that Russia sees an advantage in this simmering conflict. It allows them to put pressure on the government in Kyiv, make it more difficult for the government to effect genuine reform. It makes it more difficult for that government to draw closer to Europe. So there's going to have to be steady pressure on Europe, and that's on Russia, and that will be a challenge because I worry that maintaining European support for that kind of policy is going to become more difficult in 2017. The question of Crimea, I think, is a very difficult question. It's very difficult for me to see in the near to medium term how Ukraine musters the leverage to get Crimea back. And so what I hope to see is the United States do what the United States has done before. We can maintain a non-recognition policy. We can even if there's a settlement in Donbass, there's a subset of those sanctions which should apply to Crimea as long as Crimea is a part of Russia or until such time as until Kyiv decides, if it decides that it's prepared to accept that outcome. So that's going to be a policy. We're also going to have to work with Europe on that. I mean, I guess the one circumstance I could see where Ukraine might change this is if Ukraine would adopt the sorts of reforms that would get the country to the point, as Anders described it, where the economy is growing at 6 or 8% a year. If Ukraine were able to sustain that in comparison to a Russian economy that I think most analysts now regard as going to be stagnant for the foreseeable future, does that create a different sentiment within Crimea? My guess is that in 2014, had there been a real referendum, not the referendum that the Russians conducted, there would have been significant sentiment for aligning Crimea with Russia, but it would have been driven by the economic perception that the Russian economy was performing better than the Ukrainian economy. If Ukraine can flip that, that might be the way to get a lot of people in Crimea to reconsider, where they wish to be.
I have a slightly different view about the Crimea. It was returned in 1994-95. The Russian playbook was exercised at that point and occupied by Russia. It was returned, and it was returned partially because of the direct intervention of the President of the United States, along with Allied leaders prevailing upon Yeltsin to give it back. And we should expect the incoming president to follow suit. Question from the back.
I'm Alicia Lujan. I'm one of those average Americans that you want to get involved in all this. I've been working with Ukrainian orphans since about 2006 and refugees about since 2014 through the nonprofit out of Florida. And I'm retired from one of the defense agencies. And I have a question, Mr. Pfeiffer. Well, not a question, but a statement. It seems like the first presentation you make is exactly what Putin wants and needs to hear in order to bolster and support his position, in that you're willing to say, we'll never get it back, don't even try. I mean, that's one of the reasons they're still pushing to capture Mariupol now. I think they think the more they get, that we're going to be satisfied with any peace, and whatever they get, they're going to end up with. So why cooperate? As long as they get hearing people in your level talk like you do about Europe sounds defeatist, you're supporting them, you're encouraging them, you're speaking for them. You might as well put an RT badge on your shoulder. Your second, wait, I'm gonna finish. Your second presentation was better when you answered her. That's the kind of stuff we want to hear all the time. I mean, we need to hear not their story, but our story. Everything they say something, we should repeat something in reverse. We should never encourage them to think that we are willing to satisfy for the status quo. Thank you.
Let me say that I think you profoundly misunderstood everything I've said this morning. I've called for political support for Ukraine. I have called for more military assistance. The proposal that Ambassador Taylor described for $1 billion a year in military assistance for 3 years came out of a report that I helped author and sign my name to. I have called for additional sanctions on Russia. What I described is a policy of keeping pressure on Russia, focused on settlement in the Donbass. I think that's the priority that the Ukrainians have assigned, and that is the correct priority because it's Donbass where people are dying. I don't have time to go through my original remarks, but I don't see a single thing in those remarks that aligned with the comment that you just made.
Time for one more question.
For your participation today and for your support of Ukraine. I just returned this week from 6 months in Ukraine, working in the healthcare sector, trying to move along upgrades of medical facilities. My question is to the panel, because not just the population that I've met with over the past 6 months, but all of the agencies that can provide assistance at this time, I would like to ask what implications do you think the perceived slow pace of reforms has both in external funding and for reforms in Ukraine, how to speed up the pace. And I refer to Andrews, urgent reforms needed now. And the perceived pace by the people that I've met with and the funding agencies are that the pace of reforms are moving along very, very slowly. So I'm just asking, what implications do you think that has for next steps and foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you. I think that this is a good question because this is a dilemma. I would put the dilemma in slightly different terms. Ukraine, as I emphasized, has done very substantial reforms, but they are not comprehensive. Everybody in Ukraine discusses what has not been done. And since Ukraine is a very open society with excellent web media, it means that everything comes out. And that means that the Western community inside Ukraine and those who deal with Ukraine outside discuss all the problems rather than the accomplishments, because this is what's normally done in a democracy. You discuss what can be improved. So in this way, Ukraine loses out in the Western eye because it is so open and democratic. So I think that we simply have to become aware of this, that on the one hand, Ukraine has done a lot. On the other hand, it's so open that it discusses its problems as any Western country would do, or even more openly, because you don't have gag orders and a libel in Ukraine, which are common in the Anglo-Saxon countries. So thank you for the question, because it gives me opportunity to hammer in this message, which I think is very important for us here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up. Do you have any further comments? Steve? I would like to thank the panelists my colleagues, for excellent presentations and excellent questions from the floor. The challenges that we and Ukraine face in the coming months have to be met. And the wisdom that's been displayed by my colleagues should be put to use. And I think that it will, because the necessities are clearly there. Thank you.